opportunity. The fact that there has been no general election or other major political event in England during the past 12 months ought not to hide from us the swing of opinion that is taking place beneath the surface. England is on the road to revolution, a process that started, in my opinion, about the end of 1938. But what kind of revolution depends partly on our recognizing, in time, the real forces at work and not using phrases out of 19th century textbooks as a substitute for thought. England spent the first 8 months of war in almost the same state of twilight sleep as it had spent the 8 preceding years. There was widespread, vague discontent, but no active defeatism, as the votes at the by-elections showed. Insofar as it thought about the war, the nation comforted itself with 2 completely false strategic theories, one of them official, the other peculiar to the left. The first was that Hitler would be driven by the British blockade to smash himself to pieces against the Maginot Line. The other was that by agreeing to partition Poland, Stalin had, in some mysterious manner, stopped Hitler, who would thereafter be unable to perpetuate further conquests. Both have been utterly falsified by events. Hitler simply walked round the Maginot Line and entered Romania via Hungary, as could have been foreseen from the start by anyone able to read a map. But the acceptance of these geographical absurdities was a reflection of the general apathy. So long as France stood, the nation did not feel itself in danger of conquest, and, on the other hand, the easy victory which was supposedly to be brought about by economic means, leaving Chamberlain in power and everything just as it had been before, did not inspire much enthusiasm. No doubt most of us would have preferred a victory for the British businessmen to a victory for Hitler, but it was not a thing to grow lyrical about. The notion that England could only win the war by passing through revolution had barely been mooted. Then came the startling disasters of May and June. Although there was no political upheaval to mark it, no one who used his ears and eyes at the time could mistake the leftward swing of public opinion. The British people had had the jolt that they had been needing for years past. There had been demonstrated to them, in a way that could not be mistaken, the decay of their ruling class, the inefficiency of private capitalism, the urgent need for economic reorganization, and the destruction of privilege. Had any real leadership existed on the left, there is little doubt that the return of the troops from Dunkirk could have been the beginning of the end of British capitalism. It was a moment at which the willingness for sacrifice and drastic changes extended not only to the working class, but to nearly the whole of the middle class, whose patriotism, when it comes to the pinch, is stronger than their sense of self-interest. There was apparent, sometimes in the most unexpected people, a feeling of being on the edge of a new society in which much of the greed, apathy, injustice, and corruption of the past would have disappeared. But no adequate leadership existed. The strategic moment passed. The pendulum swung back. The expected invasion failed to take place, and, terrible though the air raids have been, they were nothing to what had been feared. Since about October, confidence has come back, and, with confidence, apathy. The forces of reaction promptly counter-attacked and began to consolidate their position, which had been badly shaken in the summer days when it looked as though they would have to turn to the common people for help. The fact that, against all expectation, England had not been conquered had vindicated the ruling classes to some extent, and the matter was clinched by Wavell's victory in Egypt. Following promptly on Sidi Barrani came Margeson's entry into the cabinet, an open, unmistakable slap in the face for all shades of progressive opinion. It was not possible to bring Chamberlain out of his grave, but Margison's appointment was the nearest approach to it. However, the defeats of the summer had brought out something more important than the tendency, normal to nearly all regimes, to swing to the left in moments of disaster and to the right in moments of security. What it had brought out was the integrity of British national feeling. After all, and in spite of all, the common people were patriotic. It is of the profoundest importance to face this fact and not try to dispose of it with easy formulae. It may possibly be true that the proletarian has no country. What concerns us, however, is the fact that the proletarian, at any rate in England, feels that he has a country and will act accordingly. The conventional Marxist notion that the workers don't care twopence whether or not their country is conquered is as false as the Daily Telegraph notion that every Englishman chokes with emotion on hearing "Rule Britannia." It is quite true that the working class, unlike the middle class, have no imperialist feeling and dislike patriotic bombast. Almost any working man sees promptly the equivocal meaning of your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory. But let it appear that England is about to be conquered by a foreign power, and the case is altered. There was a moment in the summer when our allies had deserted us. Our army had been heavily defeated and had barely escaped with the loss of all its equipment, and England, internally, was all but defenseless. Then, if ever, was the moment for a stop-the-war movement to arise, to the tune of "The enemy is in your own country," etc., etc. Well, that was exactly the moment at which the British working class flung itself into a huge effort to increase armaments production and prevent invasion. Eden's appeal for local defense volunteers got 250,000 recruits in the first day and another 1,000,000 in the next few weeks. I have reason to believe that a larger number could have been obtained. Let it be remembered that at that moment the invasion was expected to happen immediately, and that the men who enrolled themselves believed that they would have to fight the German army with shotguns and bottles of petrol. It is perhaps more significant that in the 6 months since that date, the Home Guard, a spare time, practically unpaid organization, has barely fallen off in numbers, except through the calling up of the younger members. And now let anyone compare the membership figures of the Home Guard with those of the political parties which assume that the common man is not patriotic. The Communist Party, the ILP, Mosley's organization, and the PPU may perhaps have between them an unstable membership of 150,000. In by-elections held since the war, only one stop-the-war candidate has even saved his election deposit. Is not the conclusion obvious, except to those who are unable to face facts? But the revelation of working-class patriotism coincided with the swing of opinion that I have spoken of earlier, the sudden perception that the existing social order was rotten. People dimly grasped, and not always so dimly, to judge from certain conversations I listened to in pubs at the time, that it was our duty both to defend England and to turn it into a genuine democracy. England is, in some ways, politically backward. Extremist slogans are not bandied to and fro as they are in continental countries, but the feeling of all true patriots and all true socialists is at bottom reducible to the Trotskyist slogan. The war and the revolution are inseparable. We cannot beat Hitler without passing through revolution, nor consolidate our revolution without beating Hitler. Useless to pretend, with the communists, that you can somehow get rid of Hitler by surrendering to him. Useless to imagine, with the Daily Telegraph, that you can defeat Hitler without disturbing the status quo. A capitalist Britain cannot defeat Hitler. Its potential resources and its potential allies cannot be mobilized. Hitler can only be defeated by an England which can bring to its aid the progressive forces of the world, an England, therefore, which is fighting against the sins of its own past. The communists and others profess to believe that the defeat of Hitler means no more than a renewed stabilization of British capitalism. This is merely a lie designed to spread disaffection in the Nazi interest. Actually, as the communists themselves would have pointed out a year ago, the opposite is the truth. British capitalism can only survive by coming to terms with fascism. Either we turn England into a socialist democracy, or by one route or another, we become part of the Nazi empire. There is no third alternative. But part of the process of turning England into a socialist democracy is to avoid conquest from without. We cannot, as some people appear to imagine, call off the war by arrangement and then proceed to have a private revolution with no outside interference. Something rather of this kind happened in the Russian Revolution, partly because Russia is a difficult country to invade, partly because the chief European powers were at the time engaged in fighting one another. For England, revolutionary defeatism would only be a thinkable policy if the chief centres of population and industry in the British Empire were in, say, Australia. Any attempt to overthrow our ruling class without defending our shores would simply lead to the prompt occupation of Britain by the Nazis, and the setting up of a reactionary puppet government, as in France. In the social revolution that we have got to carry through, there can be no such gap in our defences as existed, potentially, in the Russia of 1917 through 18. A country within gunshot of the continent and dependent on imports for its food is not in a position to make a Brest-Litovsk peace. Our revolution can only be a revolution behind the British fleet. But that is another way of saying that we must do the same thing that British extremist parties have always failed to do, the thing they have alternately declared to be unnecessary and impossible, to win over the middle classes. Economically, there are in England two main dividing lines. One is, at the present standard of living, at 5 GB pounds a week, the other at 2,000 GB pounds a year. The class that lies between, though not numerous compared with the working class, holds a key position, because in it is included practically the whole of the technocracy: engineers, chemists, doctors, airmen, etc., etc., without which a modern industrial country could not exist for a week. It is a fact that these people benefit very little from the existing order of society, and that their way of life would not be very profoundly altered by the changeover to a socialist economy. It is also a fact that they have always tended to side with the capitalist class and against their natural allies, the manual workers, partly because of an educational system designed to have just that effect, partly because of the out-of-dateness of socialist propaganda. Nearly all socialists who even sounded as though they meant business have always talked in terms of the old-fashioned proletarian revolution, a conception which was formed before the modern technical middle class came into being. To the middle-class man, revolution has been presented as a process by which he and his kind are killed off or exiled, and the entire control of the state is handed over to manual workers, who, he is well aware, would be unable to run a modern industrial country unaided. The concept of revolution as a more or less voluntary act of the majority of the people The only kind of revolution that is conceivable under modern Western conditions has always been regarded as heretical. But how, when you aim at any fundamental change, can you get the majority of the people on your side? The position is that a few people are actively for you, a few actively against you, and the great mass are capable of being pushed one way or the other. The capitalist class, as a whole, must be against you. No hope that these people will see the error of their ways, or abdicate gracefully. Our job is not to try to win them over, but to isolate them, expose them, make the mass of the people see their reactionary and semi-treacherous nature. But how about the indispensable middle class that I have spoken of above? Can you really bring them over to your side? Is there any chance of turning an airman, a naval officer, a railway engineer, or whatnot into a convinced socialist? The answer is that a revolution which waited for the full conversion of the entire population would never happen. The question is not so much whether the men in key positions are fully on your side as whether they are sufficiently against you to sabotage. It is no use hoping that the airmen, destroyer commanders, etc., on whom our very existence depends, will all turn into orthodox Marxists. But we can hope, if we approach them rightly, that they will continue to do their jobs when they see behind their backs a Labour government putting through socialist legislation. The approach to these people is through their patriotism. Sophisticated socialists may laugh at the patriotism of the middle classes, but let no one imagine that it is a sham. Nothing that makes men willing to die in battle, and relative to numbers, more of the middle class than of the working class are killed in war, is a sham. These people will be with us if they can be made to see that a victory over Hitler demands the destruction of capitalism. They will be against us if we let it appear that we are indifferent to England's independence. We have got to make, far clearer than it has been made hitherto, the fact that at this moment of time a revolutionary has to be a patriot, and a patriot has to be a revolutionary. Do you want to defeat Hitler? Then you must be ready to sacrifice your social prestige. Do you want to establish socialism? Then you must be ready to defend your country. That is a crude way of putting it, but it is along those lines that our propaganda must move. That is the thing that we missed the chance to say in the summer months, when the rottenness of private capitalism was already partly clear to people who a year earlier would have described themselves as conservatives, and when people who all their lives had laughed at the very notion of patriotism discovered that they did not want to be ruled by foreigners after all. At the moment, we are in a period of backwash, with the forces of reaction, reassured by a partial victory, are regaining the ground they lost earlier. Priestley is shoved off the air. Margeson goes into the cabinet. The army is bidden to polish its buttons. The Home Guard is brought more and more under the control of blimps. There is talk of suppressing this newspaper and that. The government bargains with Pétain and Franco, big and small. These things are indications of the general trend. But presently, in the spring perhaps, or even earlier, there will come another moment of crisis. And that, quite possibly, will be our final chance. At that moment, it may be decided, once and for all, whether the issues of this war are to be made clear and who is to control the great middling mass of people, working class and middle class, who are capable of being pushed in either one direction or the other. Much of the failure of the English left is traceable to the tendency of socialists to criticize current movements from the outside instead of trying to influence them from within. When the Home Guard was formed, it was impossible not to be struck by the lack of political instinct which led socialists of nearly all shades to stand aloof from the whole business, not seeing in this sudden spontaneous movement any opportunity for themselves. Here were 1,000,000 men springing, as it were, out of the ground, asking for arms to defend their country against a possible invader, and organizing themselves into a military body almost without direction from above. One would not have expected those socialists who had talked for years about democratizing the army, etc., etc., to do their utmost to guide this new force along the right political lines, instead of which the vast majority of socialists paid no attention, or, in the case of the doctrinaires, said weakly, "This is fascism." It apparently did not occur to them that the political colour of such a force, compelled by the circumstances of the time to organize itself independently, would be determined by the people who were in it. Only a handful of Spanish War veterans, like Tom Wintringham and Hugh Slater, saw the danger and the opportunity, and have since done their best, in the face of discouragement from several quarters, to form the Home Guard into a real People's Army. At the moment, the Home Guard stands at the crossroads. It is patriotic. The bulk of its members are definitely anti-fascist, but it is politically undirected. A year hence, if it still exists, it may be a democratic army capable of having a strong political influence on the regular forces, or it may be a sort of SA officered by the worst sections of the middle class. A few thousand socialists within its ranks, energetic and knowing what they want, could prevent the second development. But they can only do so from within. And what I have said of the Home Guard applies to the whole war effort and the steady tendency of socialists to hand executive power to their enemies. In pre-war days, when the appeasement policy still ruled, it was an ironical thing to read through a membership list of the House of Commons. It was Labour and Communist members who clamoured for a firm stand against Germany. But it was Conservative members who were members of the RNVR or RAFVR. It is only if we associate ourselves with the war effort, by acts as well as words, that we have any chance of influencing national policy. It is only if we have some sort of control over national policy that the war can be won. If we simply stand aside, make no effort to permeate the armed forces with our ideas or to influence those who are patriotic but politically neutral, if we allow the pro-Nazi utterances of the communists to be taken as representative of left opinion, events will pass us by. We shall have failed to use the lever which the patriotism of the common man has put into our hands. The politically unreliable will be elbowed out of positions of power. The blimps will settle themselves tighter in the saddle. The governing classes will continue the war in their own way, and their way can only lead to ultimate defeat. To believe that, it is not necessary to believe that the British governing class are consciously pro-Nazi. But so long as they are in control, the British war effort is running on one cylinder, since they will not, cannot, without destroying themselves, put through the necessary social and economic changes. They cannot alter the balance of forces, which is at present heavily against us. While our social system is what it is, how can they set free the enormous energies of the English people? How can they turn the coloured peoples from exploited coolies into willing allies? How, even if they wanted to, can they mobilize the revolutionary forces of Europe? Does anyone suppose that the conquered populations are going to rebel on behalf of the British dividend drawers? Either we turn this war into a revolutionary war, or we lose it. and we can only turn it into a revolutionary war if we can bring into being a revolutionary movement capable of appealing to a majority of the people. A movement, therefore, not sectarian, not defeatist, not anti-British, not resembling in any way the petty fractions of the extreme left, with their heresy hunting and their Greco-Latin jargon. The alternative is to leave the conduct of the war to the British ruling class and to go gradually down through exhaustion into defeat, called, no doubt, not defeat, but negotiated peace, leaving Hitler in secure control of Europe. And does anyone in his senses feel much doubt as to what that will mean? Does anyone, except a handful of black shirts and pacifists, pay any attention to Hitler's claims to be the friend of the poor man, the enemy of plutocracy, etc.? Are such claims credible after the past 7 years? Do not his deeds speak louder than his words? At George V's Silver Jubilee, there occurred a popular demonstration which was spontaneous in a different sense from the organized loyalty parades of totalitarian countries. In the south of England, at any rate, the response was big enough to surprise the authorities and lead them to prolong the celebrations for an extra week. In certain very poor London streets, which the people had decorated of their own accord, I saw, chalked across the asphalt, 2 slogans: "Poor but loyal" and "Landlords, keep away," or "No landlords wanted." It is most improbable that these slogans had been suggested by any political party. Most doctrinaire socialists were furious at the time, and not wrongly. Certainly, it is appalling that people living in the London slums should describe themselves as poor but loyal. But there would have been far more reason for despair if the other slogan had been 3 cheers for the landlord, or words to that effect. For was there not something significant, something we might have noticed at the time, in that instinctive antithesis between the king and the landlord? Up to the death of George V, the king probably stood for a majority of English people as the symbol of national unity. These people believed, quite mistakenly, of course, in the king as someone who was on their side against the moneyed class. They were patriotic, but they were not conservative. And did they not show a sounder instinct than those who tell us that patriotism is something disgraceful and national liberty a matter of indifference? Although the circumstances were far more democratic, was it not the same impulse that moved the Paris workers in 1793, the Communards in 1871, the Madrid trade unionists in 1936, the impulse to defend one's country and to make it a place worth living in?